Hello, good morning, and welcome once again to Sporting Memories and Passion, Purpose, and Grit with Goldster. Uh, it's my pleasure to welcome yet another of my special guests from the world of sport. To many people of our generation, particularly, you say the word Graveney, and everybody instantly thinks of cricket. Tom Graveney was a legendary England batsman in the 50s and 60s, but his nephew David has made an even greater contribution to our summer game. Indeed, it's hard to think of anyone who has contributed more to cricket. David joined Gloucestershire as a teenage left-arm spinner in the early 1970s, was a key part of the county's first successes of the 20th century, winning the Gillette Cup and the Benson and Hedges. He also played for Somerset and was instrumental in Durham's emergence as a first-class county, all the time helping to shape the emergent body, the Players' Union, Professional Cricketers Association. He moved smoothly into administration, becoming the national selector for the England team, the man in charge when Michael Vaughan led England to that famous Ashes success. Since then, he's had major involvement in the setting up of the England pathway for promising young cricketers, maintains a keen involvement in Gloucestershire cricket, and has just passed the milestone of 50 years involvement in cricket. Extraordinary milestone, and great to see you, David Graveney, Grav, my skipper and my teammate. And when they take this screen share off, we will be able to talk in person. There we are. Great stuff, Grav. Thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure to see you, Higgy. Looking so well.
Well, brilliant stuff. So tell me how it all started. I mean, we mentioned Graveney in cricket, and there was never any chance of you doing anything else, was there, or was there?
Well, actually, ironically, I went to Millfield off the back of my brother going to Millfield. Obviously, as you know, lots of international sportsmen played cricket there. All the cricket players that I played with, including some of our teammates like Jimmy Folk, all went on to play for England, young England. I didn't do that, so I then went back to Bristol and didn't know what I was going to do, and started studying accountancy, playing for Gloucester young cricketers and whatever. And in that year, there was the opportunity for the Cheltenham Festival, as you know, was at the back end of the season, a wicket that normally spun, and the opportunity came to play in that festival. And I can assure you, Higgy, it could have been one of three left-arm spinners. Some would be known to you, Phil Thorne, for instance, a guy called Jim Pinsent, who was playing in my club at the same time. We all played in the same team. I don't think there were any off spinners in those days. You just played lots of left-arm spinners, or slow bowlers, as I've been referred to. And I was the fortunate one to get selected to play against Lancashire. First ball I bowled was to David Lloyd, and then soon bowled to Clive Lloyd, and I couldn't quite understand why everybody retreated to the boundary. But after he hit the first shot, I understood why, because it hit me just below my right knee without me moving. I didn't get any wickets in that first game and found it really hard work. But in the second game, I owe a great debt to a guy called Chris Wilkins, who was a South African player who just wanted to hit ball for six. So unfortunately, my first ball, which could have easily gone out of the ground, he hit it straight up in the air, and I started from there, really. So it was, people think, oh, it's, written in the stars, it was bound to happen. It wasn't quite the easiest journey to go, because, I was a pretty marginal player, to be fair. So it could have been somebody else doing it rather than me.
So going to Millfield, you say there, it's a well-known, it wasn't quite it was a sporting academy as well as a different form of educational establishment, wasn't it? Because they had different rules at Millfield, didn't they?
They had different rules, and I boarded. I would have to say, boarding in a very loose team. When you can get on a bus to come back to Bristol in an hour and a half, I don't call that boarding. I think people who lived, on the other side of the world, that is proper boarding. So, as I said, I got there as a the family always used to go to Bristol Grammar School. My late brother, failed the entrance exam, and my father had played against R.J. Mayer, the headmaster at the time, both at golf and cricket. So we all went down there, walked on. His attitude of interviewing was extraordinary. He used to take the prospective pupil round the grounds and have a chat to him, play various things, golf and cricket, whatever. Came back and he said to my dad, Ken, Yeah, I'll have him, Ken. But the little boy over there who's picking his nose, I'll have him as well. So that was me. So I had 1 year in the junior school and then progressed to the senior school. And I'd have to say, Higgy, I don't know whether you bought it or not. It's very much you either love it or you hate it. And fortunately, I hated the first year because my brother was still there, and I enjoyed the remaining 3 years. So it was good.
Well, it gave you so much time to do other things. And Millfield, of course, had that ability, the facilities to indulge in whatever sport you wanted to.
Yeah, I wouldn't say the cricket was necessarily fantastic. They have fantastic coaches. The
Yeah,
facilities they have now, Higgy, are just extraordinary. They are better than I would say than some first-class grounds. They can actually cover the whole ground. So, brand new indoor school. Yeah, it's. But I think Millfield was really would be renowned basically for individual sports as opposed to team, unless you were playing rugby. Because if you're playing rugby, this was the era of Gareth Edwards
yeah,
and JPR Williams, and everybody who came from Wales seemed to end up in that F-15s.
yeah. But the ethos of Millfield, when you went there in order to further your cricket career or in order to qualify at something else, or did your parents
No,
have
I was
wider
so
ambition?
yeah, I was solely there, Higgy, because RJ O'Meara, being quite eccentric, didn't want me to go somewhere else and be better than the son he'd taken on. So I was definitely not for the first time in my life on the shirt tails of somebody else. So,
But once you were there, obviously the sport helped. I mean, you played football as well, and did you start the golf there as well?
yeah, I played golf there. I was soon rejected from the rugby team as being far too weak. So your options in the winter sports when the heroes of Milford were smashing everybody at rugby, apart again from Welsh schools, was you could play football, which I ended up playing for Somerset as a goalkeeper, and I played golf. So again, I think that is the benefit of Milford that they actually played at Burnham and Barrow, which is one of the top golf courses in the area. So, they were given the best opportunity. And the golfers now, both girls and boys, they're like sort of +2 handicappers and +3. Hackers like me wouldn't get in the teams. So. But yeah, you're right. We had varied sports. I would say, and I'm sure it was the same when you were born in school. House matches were the most violent things of all time. And I was put in goal for hockey. This was on grass pitches, not artificial, and just with pads and gloves. That was it. And I came out to narrow the angle of the opposition centre forward, and this ball whistled past my head and hit the crossbar. And the bloke who hit it was a guy called Steve Long, who went on to take short corners for Great Britain. So I decided hockey was definitely not the sport for me.
But cricket really in those days wasn't. I mean, your uncle played it, played at the highest level, and obviously made a good career out of it. But it
Yeah.
wasn't a career unless you got to the very, very top. So, how precarious did it feel to be going into it?
Well, you and I have attended over the years Gloucestershire reunions at the ground, which are always great to catch up with old friends and whatever. And I think last time I was comparing notes with our peers, basically. What was your first contract at Gloucestershire? And I think I topped the bids by being paid for £600 for a summer, which fine. I lived at home and that was okay. But obviously things have progressed from that as the game as a whole. So yeah, precarious in one way, Higgy, but not in another. I think if you've got a contract for a county, you tended to stay with that county for the majority of your career. People obviously wanted to have a benefit, so it was precarious. And I would say, in a gentle way, if you didn't perform at whatever your discipline was, then gently you were moved out of the way and somebody else came in. And I knew that I was fortunate with the other two, Phil Thorne and Jim Pinson. They could have easily been in my shoes. So, I had to perform. And in those days, you were playing on wet wickets. Spinners were expected to bowl people out. That was great. You took some wickets. But if you didn't take wickets, you'd be quickly replaced by somebody else.
And the Gloucestershire team you came into then, I mean, nowadays each county seems to have about 35 players on the books, but there couldn't have been many professionals playing for Gloucestershire at that time, and you had to play every game, presumably.
You did, yeah. I had a slight problem because my father also played for Gloucestershire for a while and became chairman and whatever. And I grew up knowing the players as a young person, whether it be Arthur Milton, Tony Brown, or whatever. And I can remember walking through the door the first time, sort of as a professional, and the first person I saw was Arthur Milton, and I had to make sure in my own mind, I obviously can't keep calling him Uncle Art anymore. I've got to call him something else. So there were lots of friendly faces. Tony Brown was my first captain, and he just played up the road at Westbury Cricket Ground with his family. So the families were all intertwined. But yeah, that's actually been a pro, and I'm sure it's the same in rugby or any other sport. What people did then, as opposed to what they do now, I could walk in that dressing room 1972, and you'd have to spot the person who didn't smoke, as opposed to where now it's not. I don't think anybody does smoke in sport, but if they do, they keep it secret. And your first job was to go down to Gloucester Road and buy all the resources for all the senior players. So you're a bit of a paid slave at that stage, but you just go in the nets and bowl, and that was the beginning of sort of a long learning curve to understand what it takes to progress.
And we mentioned Uncle Tom at the beginning of it. He was a superstar of the game. He was one of the people most talked about in cricket at the time. What was it like having him as your uncle, as it were, and with your dad alongside him?
I think I'm being very presumptuous in terms of referring to my career as I was presumptuous in as far as that I bowled as opposed to bat, Higgy. And I think that when relatives, and I always felt a bit sorry for Chris Cowdrey and Graham Cowdrey, playing in Kent and then being compared to their father was impossible. And a little bit like Liam Botham. Liam was never going to play cricket because being compared to Both was just impossible, virtually. So both on and off the pitch, I would say.
Thank goodness for that. What about, but Uncle Tom, how much of an influence was he on you?
He was he was really, really supportive. And I was wrong in saying that was my first class debut. The first match I actually ever played, and it's a ground I think you might have played at Lydney, it was like a poor man's Canterbury, because it did have a tree in the outfield. It wasn't quite the same sort of panoramic view as Canterbury. And we played in a Sunday league game against Worcester. So that had family connections. Tom moved from Gloucester to Worcester, in some controversy. So everybody rocked up to Lydney. And I can remember actually marking out my run, and I'm sure probably happened to you in sometimes in your career, though you always seem to be very confident, that I was shaking when I was marking out my run and thinking, now where is this first ball going to go? And I can remember it was bowled to Glenn Turner, who was actually one of the best one-day players at the time. And it was sort of a shin-high full toss, which he bottom edged to deep square leg for a single. So, but the person who then received the next ball was Basil D'Oliveira, who was like a brother to my Uncle Tom playing at Worcester, and probably would have been the only person other than Basil's family who knew exactly how old he was, and it was a lot older than it was portrayed publicly. And something happened then, which I think everybody likes to look at the romantic side of sport, and I bowled a second ball somewhere down the other end. That's all I can remember. And a smiling Basil D'Oliveira came the other way, missed it, and was bowled. So the second ball I've ever bowled is now taken one of England's leading batsmen at the time. And ever since that day, I've at various times of the evening or whatever, challenged Basil to say, "Did you do that on purpose?" until his dying day, he said, neither denied it or agreed. So the romantic side of me thinks that actually he did it on purpose. But he did admit that every time I bowled after him after that, I used to get him out all the time. So he probably regretted doing that first gesture. So.
What a great story. And you talked about going into the first team, the Gloucestershire team there. You came into a side that, as you mentioned, had Mortimer, Tony Brown, but also the superstars were arriving, weren't they? Procky was there,
Yeah.
Sadiq, Zahir. That must have been, I mean, I enjoyed it as well, but that must have been quite a different sort of feeling to be in a dressing room with international superstars. How did you feel?
Well, as you and I know, they were fantastic players. You know, anybody trying to bowl left or any spin at Zahir at Cheltenham, he loved batting at Cheltenham. He's actually got more double hundreds and 150s than anybody else having played the game in this country. You and I also know he did not like fielding at any stage. So he's always trying to get himself off the pitch. But they were fantastic players, and Procky in particular. And Procky actually lived with us when he came. It's like sort of one of those quiz questions. Who did Barry Richards make his debut for? So I'm just going to answer the quiz question. It was actually for Gloucestershire, not for Hampshire.
Yeah.
He actually played. They both played a little while, half summer or whatever, and Gloucestershire had to make a choice between the two. It would have been a very difficult choice, but probably Procky's all-round abilities probably ticked more box. But he was an unbelievable, and probably the person who goes under the radar was John Mortimer, and he I can remember fielding at Cheltenham. I'm trying to do whatever I'm doing at the other end, which probably was not having any effect. He was bowling from what would be called the off spinner's end because there was a slope on the ground. And he said, I'll bowl this over to John Whitehouse, who was, again, one of the emerging players at the time. And he said, just watch this, David. You'll learn something from this. So he bowled, without being over too technical, a type of ball called an arm ball, which would go the other way than an off spinner, which was very obvious. And the last ball he over, he said, right, now watch this. This is going to be a disguised arm ball, which John Whitehouse missed by about 6 inches and knocked his off stump out. And I thought to myself, this is a skill level that I'm not sure about here. So I have a lot to learn. So, but they were very kind. They always, looked after me and were sympathetic around field placings and things like that, which I think the modern spinner doesn't have that luxury. So, I was very fortunate to have. But also familiar faces. I'm sure you've had teams that you played for, particularly rugby, that you don't know anybody, and that's. Even the age group stuff that I'm involved now, I think you have to bear in mind that young people always think they're on trial all the time. So it's sometimes difficult for them to express all their skills. But started from that. And then, within less than 6 months, I was playing in a final at Lords. I'd never played at Lords.
I was just going to move on to that because from looking at all of the great names that Gloucestershire had down the years, and starting with W.G. Grace and Jessup and all of the others, and Wally Hammond and Tom Graveney, they still hadn't won anything until you and the rest of the team won that thing in the Gillette Cup in 1973. Yeah. How much of a what do you remember of the day?
Well, it was a journey itself. We actually have had just a celebration at the club, if that's the right word. Of 50 years since that event, 1973. And our journey was really odd because when it first started, the draw meant that there were 2 clubs that had to play against each other instead of playing against a then minor county. So we played against Glamorgan. Procky didn't play in the match. We managed to win in a low-scoring game. Second game was at Bristol. We played Surrey. The unhappy Brown Hats were still unhappy in 1973, actually, but they hadn't cheered up. And we found ourselves 25 for 5 against Jackman and Arnold. They made maybe a tactical decision in not bowling one of them out. And then 60 for 6. David Shepherd, myself, then put on a stand of 100 and got to 160. And we managed to win that game by a handful of runs. We then won at Essex, then with Worcester, then we go to Lords. My first problem was that I was sharing a room with Jimmy Foates, who's somebody you would know, Higgy. And the first problem was actually gaining access to the ground because before sponsored cars or anything like that. And I was driving in, for some reason, Jimmy was driving me, which was a bit of a liability. But his car was covered in Aston Villa stickers. And the pictures of the day will show that we probably had longer hair than we probably have now. And the gateman at Lords refused to allow us into the ground. He said, you can't be playing here, the way you look, and that car. So we actually had to open the boot and show them our cricket cases that actually we were playing for Gloucester. I think of the two finals that I was fortunate to play in. The first one was a blur, and the second one, you think, right, I'm going to enjoy every single minute of the second one. So it was a blur, but we managed to win the day, and we had to go. Of all the people they talk about, sort of travel arrangements for games, we had to drive to Chesterfield to play a Sunday league game the following day. I will admit we started with 9 men, but
Yes.
we'll just keep that a secret.
Yes, extraordinary way in which a showpiece occasion like that was. I mean, presumably you were playing. Were you playing a Wednesday, Thursday, Friday game before that?
Oh yeah, we played at Bournemouth before.
Yeah.
Travelled to London, got there about 8 o'clock or whatever.
Yeah.
Played the match, and then go to Chesterfield the following day. The travel arrangements and what was expected of players. All right, I know the roads are much more busier now, but it was a very demanding schedule, I would have to say.
That blur you described was a win against Sussex. I probably had a better view of it, and I was in the crowd at deep square leg on the scoreboard, and it was an extraordinary occasion because that was the first time, I suppose, that I was aware of the sort of support that Gloucestershire could have. It was a really fantastic occasion for the fans, wasn't it? Did you feel that from on the playing field?
I think what needs to be explained. There always seems to be with Gloucestershire a bit of a battle between north and south, whether it be just cricket or if it's rugby, Bristol versus Gloucester and things like that. But one thing was very obvious when we went round with the cup. The passion in the north of the county I'd never witnessed before. So we went to Lydney and all not the main rugby grounds, but smaller rugby grounds, and the passion was phenomenal. And they would have been the people who, because Bristol is a cosmopolitan city, half of it's Somerset for a start. So the support was unbelievable. But I would have to admit that first final, I don't know whether you're trying to be divorced from the action. I watched most of it on the TV in the dressing room, thinking, well, it's over there somewhere. I'm not actually part of this. But I did have a bit of a funny incident when I went to bat. Well, frightening in one way, is that you mentioned have been very kind about talking about Uncle Tom, and I always thought he was very popular with all the players he played with. We played earlier on at Hove and lost by an innings. And as we walked off, John Snow said to me, young man, I think you ought to learn how to play back, otherwise you're going to be seriously injured. I then mentioned it to Tom. He said, actually, he's one of the few blokes I don't get on with. Oh. So as I'm making my way out, having tried to find out where the door is at Lord's and still shaking again, the bloke bowling at the pavilion then was my worst nightmare. It is actually John Snow. So I went on a bit of a detour round him. And as I got parallel with him, he shouted across. He said, have you learned how to play back yet? So now this is a conundrum. I'm not quite sure what type of ball it is. Well, all I can say is trying to hook a Yorker isn't such a good idea, really. So.
Brilliant stuff. But by that time, I mean, that's in a sense gave Gloucester a taste of success. And then for the next few years, as my memory serves me, we seemed to be in there with a shout for the championship. And then, of course, came the Benson and Hedges win in '77.
Yeah, and in '77 was an extraordinary because actually we were challenged. We won the Bensons, as you remember, it was like mid season. We then were challenging for the championship. The last game of the season was against Hampshire, and I think there have been a number of occasions, and the mid '80s was another time where we just failed at the final hurdle of not actually believing enough. And the sides who win are the ones who have the inner belief. You and I played against Middlesex. All of them are international cricketers. They just have that edge that gets you over the line. So it was enjoyable. That is a shame. We've had opportunities to win the championship and we've come up short, sadly.
And you went on to become captain, and like Tom, had your parting of the ways with Gloucestershire. Is that an inevitable thing that the people in the middle see the game differently from those that theoretically pay the wages and or guide the strategy? Is that inevitable? It seems to happen so often in sport.
It is, and I've actually I've been corrected by Julie, who you know, my wife, who's just saying
Yeah,
you always keep talking about being sacked. Well, in sport, that
yeah,
happens. You're never going to get a job for life. You know, people change what they're going to do. Um, my situation was a little bit more complicated because of past history with the family. But it is, sport is like that. You would have witnessed it the same as me. Um, yeah, and the well-run sides have a really the people who run it run the club. The people who run the cricket are the people who understand what the cricket is, and sometimes it can be confused. Some extraordinary people in business, and when they're talking about their passion, which is cricket, tend to leave their brains outside the door, and it's their heart leading them rather than their head. So. I would say one of the great failings in our period of time that we had is the lack of communication. Everybody realizes it has to be a difficult decision. And I only learned that, Higgy, when I was chairman selected. You know, Ian McLaren, who was the chairman, said, I want you to ring everybody every test match, whether they're in the team or not in the test match. So because everybody deserves an explanation. And I didn't. I think in terms of when I was captain of Gloucester, I didn't learn that enough to communicate with the team, with the supporters, particularly. I was perceived to be quite aloof or whatever, and even I made reference to what we used to do in terms of spin bowlers when I first started. You'll remember that we all went to the West Indies with Brownie, Tony Brown, and you know it was still up in the air who was going to be captain. I think he put us all on trial, if I remember rightly. I did one game, you did another game, Stov did another game, Andy Stovall. So yeah, I've been very well. Sometimes when you're losing, you think, why am I captain? I wish somebody else would do it. But yeah, it could have easily been somebody else, and hopefully I would have shown the same loyalty as you and Stov did to me when that decision was made.
but then you moved on to Somerset next, and then to Durham. How did they compare with the Gloucestershire experience?
Well, I think if again hindsight's a wonderful thing, Higgy. I think that I mistakenly, when I was replaced as captain, thought I should stay, but actually an ex-captain. I've seen it sort of in other areas, like particularly internationally. And I think when you lose the captaincy, you're in catch-22. If you say too much, you're meddling. If you say nothing, you're perceived to be sulking in the corner. So I think if I had my time again, and Jack Birkinshaw was trying to persuade me to come to Somerset. You know, I was educated in Somerset. I didn't realise at the time that I would have been the first person to make that move, which was quite historic. And I probably should have moved 2 years before. The 2 years I had when I wasn't captain, I don't think I behaved really very well, and I should have moved on and allowed people to make a fresh start, basically.
Right, and so with Somerset, explain the differences between the two.
Well, the boundaries are shorter, Higgy, as you will well know. So, actually, the side that we had was really, really good. Wasn't the best side in the world. Had the opportunity to play with Jimmy Cook, South African batsman, who was just outstanding as an individual as well. Chris Tadbury was the captain, again, wonderful guy. And it was just before Caddick started playing for Somerset, so we were a bit weak in bowling. And I took some wickets to start with, and Peter Anderson, who was then the secretary, I think they call him then, not chief executive, came up to me and said, "Grab, are you enjoying, coming to Somerset?" I said, "Yeah, the club is really nice." He said, "Do you think you could do me a favour?" I said, "What do you want?" He said, "You're doing really well with the ball, but I think you like to bowl from the river end, which is about 4 yards longer than the other way." He said, "You are costing us a lot of money in terms of balls going into the river. Do you think you can go the other way? At least we can get back to the cemetery." And that is for real. That's what he told me to do. So I kept bowling from the other end.
Save the club a few quid.
Yeah, well, 70 quid a ball. Can't use an efficient amount of that river. So.
And the Durham experiment. Explain how you got involved with that, and how the whole thing took shape.
Yeah, well, Durham had made various attempts to become first class status. and it was either an individual bid or with Northumberland. And one of my best friends, or two best friends, Phil Bembridge, who we played with, had gone to Durham to play as a minor county, and Jeff Cook, who was probably my best friend playing cricket, had also moved up there, and he was trying to recruit players to play, and I was sad to leave Somerset because it was I'd only just experienced one summer, but the opportunity, it just had a symmetry really, because the Graveney family came from the northeast, and just a fantastic opportunity. So, given the distance, living in Bristol, and we place as professional sportsmen a lot of sacrifice on our families, and it happened to be that the kids were at school, and how was I going to make that work? So I can remember I flew to start with, and when Baines was playing, we shared the driving, which was interesting, sitting in a car for about 5 hours and get to go and have a net. My bowling was even stiffer than it normally was. But it was a really enjoyable time, and then I learned how to, I think a lesson, late in life is when things aren't going well, instead of hiding away, you've got to communicate with the people who come to watch you. All right. They may not agree with what you're saying, but at least speak to them and see and explain where the club is heading. So it was an extraordinary setup of teams. We had 7 people, I think, over 35, and 4 local lads. There was certainly a rush to field at slip in that team and not at cover. And then one Sunday league game, he played against Surrey. It was actually Adam Holyoke's debut, because he said I abused him. Can't believe he did that. But the age of the 4 people in the circle, without overcomplicating, was over 160 years. So that shows the age of our team at that stage. So.
Yeah. Was there a sense of it being a trailblazing thing for the players, that you needed to have this mixture of seen it all, done it all players like yourself in order to take the step into?
Yeah, it was about. It's obviously the signing that they needed was Boss, Ian Botham, who still was playing one-day cricket for England. Dean Jones was an inspired choice, just the way he played his cricket. Paul Parker, who you will know, went to Cambridge and Sussex again. Just the guys that Jeff picked were really good and would contribute. Some of his own friends, like Wayne Larkins, played with him at Northampton. Simon Hughes, they were all sort of quite eccentric at some stage. So when I was captain and everybody dispersed after a game, I was often thinking, I can remember being at Horsham and I'd gone home for a few days. I thought, are they all going to come to the match, or are we going to not have a team to play? But they all rocked off in different directions and did all various things. So it was an enjoyable experience, only sort of slightly dimmed by the fact that we weren't in the autumn of our careers. Certainly, me personally, it was more in the winter of my career, really. So, and it was confirmed when I played at Scarborough in one of my last games, and the bloke shouted from the crowd, "I think you need a Zimmer." I said, "All right, I think I get the message." So.
But it must make you and the other players, I've spoken to Paul a lot as well, make you feel proud to see the way in which Durham has.
It's extraordinary. Really. The first, I don't know whether you've ever been to the ground, Higgy, the university ground in the middle of Durham, which is overlooked by a high security prison. And the first game we ever played was against Lancashire, Sunday League game. And I went to the ground the day before, and there was a father with a young son who didn't have a ticket to the game, speaking to the gateman, saying, "Do you mind if I walk my son around the ground so he can say that he was there when Durham started?" That was the passion.
Yeah, fantastic. And as you said, the man who shouted out about the Zimmer gave you the message finally. But all this time, that I mentioned at the beginning, you'd been involved with the Players' Union, the Cricketers' Association. From my early days, I remember we didn't really have a union, and we certainly didn't have any industrial power or anything like that. Explain how it all began and how you got involved and what it has become now.
Yeah, well, each county had a representative. So when it first started, and this was under the auspices of a guy called Jack Bannister at Warwickshire. There are pictures of Jimmy Hill, who also was involved with the PFA, sort of trying to start us as a player union. And as you say, we didn't have any funding. Actually, ironically, the only funding we had £5,000 from John Player, who were one of the sponsors of the day. So there was very limited things that we could do. But when you have somebody like John Arlott as your president, then things start to happen. And there was very soon things that were happening that were huge issues in the game. Whether Kerry Packer, if you remember, Higgy, was split the game completely. There were lots of dressing rooms where players who were engaged wouldn't speak to other people involved because they thought they'd been letting down their respective countries. Then there were rebel tours to South Africa. So John was an extraordinary person to lead those discussions, which always took place in Birmingham. My job was to sit next to him and just act as a marker of who's actually asking the questions. He obviously would have known a lot of them, but not everybody in the room. My function at lunchtime, he used to carry a case with him, a briefcase with him, and I often wondered what was in that briefcase. And I knew exactly what I had to do the first lunchtime. He said, David, can you go and find me a corkscrew, please? So out came 2 bottles of claret with a glass. And then he became much more lucid in terms of and passionate about like the Kerry Packer and South Africa. And he's just a wonderful man. And it grew from that. But this is in an era when the players who played, my uncles, and even when you and I started, we had no pensions, we had no medical cover. It was just ridiculous, really. And it's no wonder, and it obviously doesn't happen now. There was a book written, I think David Frith, who wrote about that there were more suicides in the professional cricket than any other sport. And you know, you and I know that from our counties and players that went before us. Once your lifespan was finished, there's the gate, and they were never seen again. They could have gone anywhere. So the PCA, the objective was to protect the players, and also, and I don't know what your family said to you, but my dad, though he had even played cricket before professionally, said, "Is there any chance of you getting a proper job at any stage? Because I paid for your school fees." Which I thought was a rather bizarre thing to say. But I think the point he was making is that when your career finishes mid-30s, you're then trying to join a different world, or the real world, or whatever he wants to talk about, with no qualifications. And to gain employment there, and then you've got a family, you've got a mortgage and things like that. It was really, I think, to prepare people for what happens after playing was really the objective. And fortunately, and probably under Matthew Fleming's leadership as a chairman, that actually we managed to get the ECB or then the Teston County Cricket Board, to understand they needed to make it a fairer employment for people. So we had a minimum wage and lots of things that protected the players.
Yeah, I mean, some of our listeners won't really understand or appreciate this. That it wasn't that long before we played that they were the gentlemen and players. They were amateurs in the game. That your contract ended as soon as the last game was over. So what did you do in the winter? Sorry, there was no continuity of employment for people. You were a cricketer from the 1st of April till the last game of the season, and then you weren't.
And that was it. Yeah, and people sold cars or did something. The more enlightened one realised that. And I don't know whether this is a correct analogy, Higgy, but I was running to a railway line, and the train coming towards you was a dot on the horizon. And to try and get people to understand, to make provision so they can make that transition. It's not easy. Transition from being people wandering around asking for your autograph for whatever reason or whatever, and you are a star perceived to being just, somebody who walks in the pub and nobody knows what you're doing and whatever. So that was the function of, and you're right about the players and gentlemen. Even on the school card, the players were referred by their surname only. And somebody showed me at Taunton, there were two different gates from the dressing room at the bottom of the ground, one for the pros and one for the gentlemen, as they were.
And this was only a few years before we played.
Oh yeah, but they had that fixture at Lords, didn't they? Gentlemen and the pros.
Yeah,
that was in the early 60s.
So when you look now at the strides in which the PCA have made and the provision they make for, and the encouragement and the way in which they nurture and look after the well-being of all of the professional players, both men and women, I mean, you must feel an enormous amount of pride in that.
Yeah, I've had made observations, not massive disagreements, but they also did a really good job for those who play for England. The Team England player partnership is just channeling all the sponsorship money that's related to the international team. I personally think, and I might be wrong, that sometimes that is the priority, is a small group of players who are obviously playing the top of the game, but actually the PCA's role is to represent everybody. So across the board, whether it be a young lad who's 18, sitting in the dressing room. I did have an unusual, when I was sort of more directly involved with the PCA, have an interesting conversation. I used to go to pre-season meetings that you and I would have done as a player, and I approached a very young-looking guy in Yorkshire and then said, congratulations on you getting your first contract. What are you going to do when it ends? And he looked at me quizzically. What do you mean? I'm just about to start. Well, it won't last forever. And unfortunately, I chose the wrong bloke. It was Joe Root. So, so I think he's done quite well at the game.
Well, yeah. But there was no provision for life after cricket or even during cricket at that time. So now that the players are now largely employed the whole year round, and they have pathways and help to further their career. So there's a lot of emphasis on after career stuff as well, which I find incredibly reassuring. What are your thoughts about that? Is there still more to be done, or has the PCA got
it's a bit of a cleft stick, Higgy, actually. As pay has increased, when we played, and I'm not trying to portray to people listening to this that we were the hard done by, but there was definitely a need for us to go and find something else to do. You play two different sports, which is fantastic. But for other people, but again, you've got to meet other people who are not cricketers, and there is an outside world outside the dressing room and batting and bowling and whatever. I sometimes think now the pay level has risen, which is great, but there's a bit of a reticence to get out and say and accept that actually it can't last forever. And I think that would be the point I would try and make to people, that get out there and meet people and identify something that you can do. And the PCA have been really good at signposting alternative careers, and that's not always a lawyer or an accountant or anything like that. There are other things that people can do. And actually, I personally think that actually everybody who starts their career should have a coaching qualification, because that is a transferable skill that they can take once they finish.
So apart from this, all of the many strings to your bow, let's talk about being the national selector. How did that come about, and how did you enjoy it? And
well, not correcting your script, Higgy, I'm the last ever chairman of selectors. How that happened was there was a bit of a hoo-ha about Raylingworth writing a book. That was because I started off as a selector. The board wanted to have somebody who just recently retired, and that's actually now followed like somebody like Luke Wright is a selector now, and he's only just hung up his bat. And so I was offered to do that, and it fitted in really with what I was doing with the PCA, to go around the grounds as a selector. That's fine. I think, again, another lesson that I learned was actually being chairman of selectors is a conflict, because actually you are the person, though you consult the people who is held accountable for making those decisions. So when I was selected for a couple of years, I think with the existing selectors, without mentioning by name, didn't particularly like some young upstart, and I use the young loosely, getting in on their parade. And then 2 years after that, Illy stood down, and I was put forward by Mike Smith of Warwickshire as the chairman selectors. So I had to have that signed off by the PCA, which they did with reluctantly, I think. And I turned up at my first match, one-day match. Well, first thing I did was I couldn't understand that every pre-test match, there was a huge dinner where all the team were invited to, and the chairman selectors sat next to the new caps as if it was some sort of father figure or something like that. So I scrapped that idea. The players hated it. They just wanted to prepare themselves for what was going to be a huge game the following day. So the first game I had was against Australia in '97. Turn up, and it was the time when Adam Holyoake, Ben Holyoake, the late Ben Holyoake, played and won the game. We mashed them 3-0 or whatever. People didn't separate one day in test matches, so Australia came with their test match squad and then played one-day cricket. So we then go to Edgbaston, and at lunch, Australia 50 for 8. I'm thinking, well, this is a pretty easy job. This, what's all the issue about? Well, that soon changed when we moved to Lords to the second test. We won that first one eventually. Second test, Glenn McGrath took 8 for 30, and we lost that. So, but it was an interesting, and you know, you have been good enough to play sport at the very highest level. I wasn't good enough for that. So to go to test match ground, stand in the middle of Lords before a test match against Australia, you do pinch yourself. You think, how can you get to this position?
So how did you see your role as the chairman of the selectors? Is it marrying everybody's opinions together, having the casting vote?
Yeah, I think one person trying to make all the decisions is the ultimate arrogance you could possibly have. So I learned over the years 2 lessons. You try and persuade the captain of the day to look at other options, but if he is adamant, then you have to give him the right support. If you have a meeting of selectors, you may disagree, and you should disagree, because why bother to have a panel of selectors? But the moment you walk out the door, you're all on the same page, whether you agree to it or not. There was 2 lessons for that, but the one about the captain, and gentle persuasion or whatever, I got to talking to umpires. I found umpires a good source of information because they're out there, and a lot of them are ex-players. And also talking to, I got into a habit of going to grounds and asking the captain of a particular county, what do you think of the opposition, not their own players? Because when they talk about their own players, they might have fallen out with them, so they think, oh, he can't play, or he's just got 100 and he's the best player in the world. So but when talking about opposition players, you've got a better idea. And I would have to admit to something, this might sound absolute sacrilege, but I was very fortunate to build up a relationship with Shane Warne, and I just asked Warne, do you mind helping me in my job? I said, what do you mean? Well, you are the best bowler the world has ever seen. So if you're looking at our batsmen, who do you rate? Because you're playing for Hampshire. So I'd have to admit, and it doesn't happen now, but we used to go around the back of the pavilion and have a cigarette. So I'd give him a cigarette, and then he'd tell me about what he thought of our players. The only proviso is that he would not help me in trying to beat Australia, which is fair enough. So what I'm trying to say is I draw information from a lot of people. So.
And is there something different about a test match animal as opposed to a good county cricketer?
I think, and again, you could relate to this, I think I got more driven as I went along, Higgy, by the quality of the individual, as opposed to figures. That obviously you have to play to a certain level, but I found that figures can be really misleading, particularly in cricketing, because you don't know the opposition, don't know the circumstances of the game, quality of the wicket, and so it was the quality of the person that would probably be the thing that was the key factor for me, and sadly, how you deal with the media. To remember you've been selected because of the way you play. The fact you're on a big stage and you've got Jeff Boycott pulling your batting apart or doing it with bowlers or whatever, stick to your gun. That's very hard. And people who say they never read the press, that is the biggest fib they've ever said. Might not be directly, but they'll find out indirectly sooner or later.
And these are young people as well, aren't they?
Yeah, and they haven't been put in that situation, and they learn. And I've been fortunate enough to work with, and there are a couple of people who stand out for me, who we knew that would always cope with. One was Alastair Cook, and the other one was Michael Vaughan. That from just talking to them right from the outset, you knew that they were going to be able to cope with the stage.
They're going to cut us out of time in a minute or so, but I want to talk to you about your next roles in the pathway. How do you identify the talent of the future? What have you said about?
It's the same way. You've got tiers of whether it be under 15 to under 17, under 19. Under 19s, we just finished a series against the West Indies. Talking to their coaches, getting to know them as individuals, and then there's a World Cup every 2 years. And the next one is in Sri Lanka in January of 2024. Where they will have a severe test by spin, because everybody around the world in the Asian that area think that England can't play spin. Probably might have been right in the past, probably not now. Interesting, that picture you showed at the beginning, that was me presenting the man of the series under 19s against India. Subharam Gill now is regarded as one of the best players in the world, and that's only a few years ago. Yeah. So it's to prepare them to become a professional player, and just say, it's really dull. Sometimes you've got to practice and practice and practice, because you've got to know your skill under the extreme pressure. So you've got to be, and this is more as a bowler, really.
So of all the jobs you've done in cricket, which has given you the most satisfaction?
I think actually one we just briefly touched on it. Some of them have been fantastic experiences or whatever, but the job I do now, probably because it's the most vivid, is to be president of the Professional Cricketers Trust and to help cricketers and their families that have fallen on hard times. And there's a person that joined, a guy called Jamie Hood, played under 19 cricket. And joined Yorkshire same time as Michael Vaughan did. So there's and unfortunately, tragically for him, he was involved in a car crash and broke his neck. He lives in Marske-on-the-Sea near Middlesbrough, and I go and see him. Would like to see him more, but don't. But we supported him all the period of time through that time. And if you and everybody will know people that they're in the company of people who are completely uplifting in terms of the way they live their life, and also bring perspective to your life. And Jamie Hood is that. And there are lots of other cases that are quite emotional, but that would be the most rewarding thing I do.
So in the 50 years that you've been involved in the game, have you worked out how many days you've actually attended cricket?
No, somebody asked me how many balls I bowled. I wouldn't know, and I have some very understanding people around me. I think that allow me to, and it's a passion, it's a love. It's sort of it's had its downsides. When England haven't done very well, or things I've done in my life which quite rightly have attracted criticism. That's not much fun, but in the main, it's just been a privilege to do. So
is cricket in a good?
I'll work that out at some stage.
Is cricket in a good state now? We've just had the report about the racism. We've got this.
Yeah, it's an ongoing thing. I think it's, I'll sit down, you and I have a beer at some stage, but there are lots of things happening in the game. The creation of the IPL, I thought right at the outset would move the goalposts, and that transpired to see what has happened. So the motivation of, we never thought that would happen, that people would choose between playing for the country and earning obviously considerable amounts of money. Not saying it's wrong, but it's just a different landscape that we're used to. I think there are some challenges for county cricket. I think the initiatives around, and let's not be pessimistic, what is happening with women's cricket, I think is brilliant. I'm not so convinced about the amount of either 20 or 100 ball games that we're playing. I would want to protect the Test match cricket, because Test match cricket, in my mind, is the most exciting cricket you can play, because it ebbs and flows. You can lose one day, win the next day, and to me, being involved, and I was marginally involved in 2005, were the most extraordinary Test matches I've ever seen. Really, so.
The Freddie Flintoff, the Michael Vaughan Ashes.
Yeah, and yeah, sorry, I should have pointed out that. And I can remember being stopped in Westbury-on-Trym, where I lived in Bristol, by two ladies who said, "You're David Graveney, yeah? Yeah. And is Test match cricket like this all the time?" I said, "Well, not really." But, and this was after one Test match, the one at Edgbaston, or second Test, sorry. So yeah, I think the bottom line is that I think cricket is in a good place, but everybody has to work together, and we have to also not be that arrogant to know that the game is developing at rapid speed around the world. You and I could have said they're going to play in America. They were playing in America. They play baseball. Well, just see what's going to happen next year. They are playing in America, and they will build grounds. So the scope is widening, and we've got to work hard to keep our game in the right position.
We touched on it briefly before, that cricket struggles sometimes to keep pace between the administration and the playing side of things. Have we got the right administration in place to deal with the future that is going to be shown to us by these different influences you talked
about? I think so. Yeah, I know Richard Gould really well, because he's Bristol based. He was at Somerset as well. It's a demanding job to keep all the counties on side, and I think the commission report is obviously a very good piece of work to have been done, but I think it was frightening for the game to realise lifting up the floorboards, it's actually not quite as good as you thought it was. So, and that's going to be a massive job, but the end result will be good. That if I'm just looking at the county we play for Gloucestershire, that if we engage all the people that should be engaged, and give everybody should have a chance to play cricket. That's all we should. Doesn't matter from what background or whatever. Give them a chance and play the right type of cricket. When you're little, play on shorter pitches. The image I have is somebody having pads that come up to their waists, a bat they can't pick up, and a pitch that's too long. You're not going to be playing cricket doing that. That's not an enjoyable experience. So we've got to make sure it is for everyone.
So it's a question of a sport being in transition. Are we in transition? Are all sports in transition, or is it?
I think they're all. I think they are. Again, we have to respond to the demands of society, and ours are being challenged, quite rightly, of what has happened over the last 12 months, and we have to respond to that. If there are sections of the population feeling they're being denied the opportunity to play. Not that I've seen any evidence of that, but I'm not stupid enough to think that it doesn't exist. We need to, that's our first priority. Everybody's got to have a chance to play. And
you will continue being behind the scenes with the Professional Cricketers Trust, and you've still got an involvement with Gloucestershire, is that right?
Yeah, I'm on the executive board. I've had one experience, and then can't use sacks, just replaced. And yeah, Gloucestershire itself has some challenges, and the challenge is the landscape's changed from when you and I played. That we didn't have any agents or anything like that. So the question of you and I playing for Gloucester for a number of years and not for anybody else, that's what you did. Now players, that unless the circumstances of the club are good enough, they will move on. So the club has to work hard at keeping, and Gloucestershire haven't had a successful year, but they have developed a core of young players. But they have to show to the players that actually the club has ambition, and the cricket, they're there to play cricket and hang on to your assets. And hopefully, if I can contribute in that way, that's what I'm trying to do. Until somebody taps you on the shoulder and says, "Grav, that's enough."
Fantastic, Grav. Thank you so much. 50 amazing years in cricket. It's been brilliant talking to you again.
Catching you.
Everything again. David Graveney, everybody. What a servant to cricket. Thanks so much, Grav.